Hello, educators of Virginia. Welcome to today's episode with Alice Oakley, where we will explore how to look at student work to uncover their thinking. Alice co-founded Education Resource Group, ERG, to provide high-quality staff development that promotes the growth of all learners, and co-authored the ASCD published book, How to Look at Student Work to Uncover Student Thinking. I am overwhelmingly excited to dive deep today with Alice Oakley. Alice, welcome. How are you?
I am great, Chris. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon.
I want to thank you so much for spending time, but I'm not going to let you off the hook with the I am great. Our listeners know that when I ask our guests how they are, I really mean it, and I really want to know how you are. So given where you are, or where we are in the universe, in this space, all the things that have gone on, and it just feels like piles and piles and piles. We are now 2 years in to the pandemic. We've really experienced some serious racial injustices. They've been brought to light. We are experiencing these political polarities where it seems that schools are wedged in the middle. But in our lives and where we are, given our current context, how are you showing up in this space?
Well, since you put it like that, I am excited about a lot of things. And at the same time, I think I am feeling overwhelmed a tiny bit. And those things are on the same continuum. So if I put my mom hat on, I lived through lockdown with students in my home. And for those of us that are parent educators, we know that was a very trying time. And we're lucky we all got out of that alive, literally and figuratively. And my kids are now back in school. And that's been a really nice thing to watch, is how quickly and resilient children have responded. And that's been really good. If I put my educator hat on, I'm a little worried about sort of a regression that has happened with some of us as we went home and kind of cocooned ourselves and then had to emerge. We've sort of exposed some issues that have happened or were in the process of happening. I kind of look at the pandemic as an accelerator. And so things that were there that were good are now great and amazing. And then things that were just a little bit, off center are extremely off center at this point. And so I get very excited at the opportunities in education, and I try really, really hard to look at how can I be part of the solution and not just look the other way.
Oh gosh, I appreciate that response so much, Alice. I really, I love that energy of being forward thinking, especially right now as we are, we're not out of the woods yet with the pandemic, but there's promise, there's hope, there's optimism that we're close, and it's coming right at the time when spring is upon us. And so I love that forward thinking, that solutions oriented perspective, because it would be very easy to just talk about all the problems and live in those spaces, but we've got to move beyond just identifying the problems and really work towards collaborative solutions to help, because there is a lot of work to be done. I love what you said about the things that were good are great, and the things that were not so good have been exacerbated and elucidated on the other side of that spectrum. And so thank you for sharing your perspective and how you're showing up. I'm showing up extremely well. I've recently transitioned roles. I am the new executive director for VASCD. As you know, in my introduction and my reach out to you, and I'm coming right out of a school. I was a high school principal in Chesterfield County, Virginia, and it's been an extremely tough year. And so for me, that that new level of busy and what it means to be busy now versus what it meant just 2 weeks ago for me. My stress levels, my personal health, my time with my family. I mean, I'm cooking dinner again. So I am showing up in this space very, very well. And so I appreciate you sharing this space with me. I'm loving your energy coming into today's podcast. So now that we know how we are and how we're showing up in this space, let's really dig into your work, Alice. And so formatively assessing students, getting and giving just-in-time feedback and making supporting adjustments for them is such an important role for student learning processes and outcomes, especially when we consider what you just unpacked for us when you put both your mom and your educator hat on. So can you tell us why this is so important and what you are so passionate about when it comes to uncovering student thinking?
Yes, I can definitely tell you that. A little backstory on this is my company, Education Resource Group, is about 18 years old now, and we have had the privilege to collaborate with national researchers and authors through the years. And so Dr. Susan Brookhart co-authored this text with me, and we started the work prior to pandemic and not knowing what was coming. And thank goodness I didn't know, or I think I would have been terrified to agree to conduct professional development and then write about it. And so the good part was we were able to do professional development before the world shut down, and then I was able to write. And what came of that is the book. And it was actually the brainchild of folks at ASCD. And so Susan Brookhart has multiple books under the formative assessment umbrella. And the wise folks at ASCD said, hey, could you come up with a book that's kind of a how-to related to the feedback work? So we know that the feedback work is just so critical in learning and in achievement, but how does that really look and sound if we take it into the classroom? And so I gathered up some volunteer folks who agreed to meet before school, after school, during school hours, gave up planning time to really just bring student work samples to the table. And we just started this work in a very authentic grassroots, let's just bring it to the table and talk about it and see what happens. We knew that through the research that when you bring folks to the table and have them look at student work to really examine student thinking versus is it correct, that really good things happen from that. So that's kind of the whole premise of the book for people out there that maybe aren't going to read the whole thing. They just need a little cheat sheet. The idea is that if you really take student work and you're just checking it and then moving on, you're really missing all these opportunities. And so in the book, we unpack the process of how do you examine student work in a strategic way? And then what in the world do you do with all the information that you get? And so basically the idea is that you just take the student work that you have, you notice what you notice, you start to infer, well, what does this tell me about this learner? And then you move into that feedback piece of what's a really important, effective piece of feedback I can give this learner to move forward. And then the fourth thing is, okay, what's the next move instructionally? And so what this book does is it really provides a variety, a K-12, different subjects of how to do that process of really just digging into the work and thinking through, well, what are my instructional moves? And so the other thing that blossomed out of that work and that also tracks with the research is that when professionals do this, they become even better at the feedback process, and they become better at picking those next instructional moves, making those professional decisions.
Yeah. So you said something in there that I'd love for you to say more about. I had to jot down a couple of notes, but you said uncover their thinking versus whether or not it's correct. Say more. Say more there. What do you
Okay,
mean?
definitely. So I like to tell people that I'm a recovering, not so great teacher. Back in the day, long time ago, I would assign work and I would get the work back and I would check. I might record the grade and I would move on.
Yeah.
I didn't involve the students in the checking. I didn't really look to see what they understood. Some days I would go home mad thinking, I just spent 2 weeks on this unit and they don't know anything. These kids are so dumb. Well, it turns out, I needed to do some work. It turns out that when you start to really look at the student thinking in the work, that these amazing things happen. And so, for example, we had students or teachers and we talk about it in the book, but they brought student samples, kindergarten samples, and the students weren't able to fully write sentences yet. And so they were basically representing their thinking through drawing. And so we were looking at the characters and setting, and were they able to fully understand what the characters were, what the setting was. And so we took a class set of drawings and we put them on the table and we categorized them into students who we could tell really understood the difference between character and setting based on the drawings. Some who were beyond that. And then there were 2 or 3 students who they were still moving towards that. So that teacher was able to leave that session thinking about, okay, well, what do I do next? Not just for the ones that are moving towards the standard, but the ones that are well beyond it. She can't continue to ask them to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect to grow them as learners. And so that kind of power is what's behind looking at the student thinking versus that bad practice that I did of just check and move on.
That's fascinating. And so, I love what you said there, because really when you uncover their thinking, it's like determining the Goldilocks of where the students are, so to speak.
Exactly
Those kids who are right on target and they're meeting the standard, those kids who are ready to turn algae into jet fuel, and then those kids who are going to need a little bit more or different or more intensive support in order to get them to that middle spot. So I appreciate how what your work does helps inform a teacher's practice and adjustment for each of their kids. And so, when we talk about the importance, I want to kind of bridge where we were talking about when we checked in with how we're showing up in this space with the role of looking at student work to uncover thinking. What is the role of that work, especially when we're talking about accounting for unfinished learning? As we emerge out of the darkness of the pandemic, these kind of this unfinished learning that masses of children worldwide, not just in our nation, are experiencing. So what do you feel is so powerful about your work in addressing and accounting for that?
Well, I love this question because I do feel that all of us are not going to get any more hours in our day. And we are continuing to pile things on the plates of educators. And so I think we need to be thoughtful and we need to be strategic. And so that's where this work falls, because in looking at the student work, you have in front of you what I consider the most important data that's going to come out of the classroom. It is the student thinking in the act of learning. And so if we can sort of redefine data as not just a bunch of numbers coming at us from 1,000 different sources, if we can look at the data we have right in front of us, I think that this is the most important piece, because it's telling us in real time, what are our students able to do? What do they know? What do they not know? And then what can we do next? And so it's truly anchoring our thinking in what does the learning need to look like and sound like, in addition to it simultaneously puts the students in the center of our decision making. And so we are fighting all this noise in education right now. With it comes with an avalanche of data. And in my work, I feel like for sure, there's no more important data that we have in front of us than what our kids are thinking in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I love that. I think, right now, if you're experiencing, data heavy is, the word I'm thinking about is data driven. And I don't know how you feel about that phrase. I learned from George Couros a couple of years ago that we're not data driven, we're student driven and data informed. And so if you're in a situation where it's data heavy and it's about the numbers, I agree with you. We've got to go deeper than the numbers, because the numbers that we're looking at are more like, there's a metaphor I've heard in the past. Those numbers that we can either use that data as a flashlight or a hammer, but that's like autopsy data. The data you're talking about is like going to the doctor for a checkup data.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how, just living in that space, how powerful that you mentioned real-time feedback and anchoring their thinking. Can you talk about why it's so important to spend more time in the checkup with the doctor versus the autopsy after it's already done?
Yes. So the power of, I love that metaphor. The power of the checkup is, I think, what we all know, in that we can catch things quickly and we can also prevent things. And so, for example, one of the trends that happened with some of our sessions looking at student work, and I'm working in a school right now doing similar work, and we're starting to see the same thing of, we've got a group of students that are traditionally very high achievers. And on certain assignments, and it just so happens that the most recent example I have is math, that they were given a sort of a math problem and they could solve it in a variety of ways. They could choose how they solved it, and then they had to unpack their thinking about how they solved it. So as we were examining the student work, we noticed that several students had solved it correctly, but had not unpacked their thinking. So the teacher said to them in a feedback episode, I appreciate that you have the right answer, but I really need you to unpack how you solve this so I can understand your thought processes. She gives it back to them. They do another assignment, different problem, same setup. We had to solve it and unpack. And these same students got the problem wrong. And then they started to unpack their thinking. And what the teacher noticed through this examination of this work is that it was her highest achieving students had somehow on the front side been getting the right answer, but going about the problem in the wrong way. As the material became more complex and more complicated, those holes popped right up. They got a wrong answer, but if she had not had that unpacking piece, she wouldn't have been able to connect those dots. So very quickly, easily, the next day, she pulled together a small group of students and she gave them honest, effective feedback and said, hey guys, here's what I noticed we're doing. Here's what you were doing when we worked on this. And here's another way we can come at this. So let's talk about this together. Yeah. And it wasn't a major production. No one got an F, no one got a 0. It was more about how are we taking these children with what they're giving us and how are we moving them forward, very much like a checkup. We want to stay out of the hospital. We want to stay out of the autopsy zone.
Yeah, no, I love that. And if you don't mind, I want to maybe explore at least one question. You mentioned there about, the students were, and it seemed like you were talking about a little bit more simplistic or rote type solutions that they were getting right. But as things got more complex and the thinking was uncovered, it was the thought process that was, I'm going to say flawed, but there was no high stakes, yeah, high stakes is the word I'm looking for. With, you mentioned no F, there's no zero. So I guess the question that I really want to ask, and maybe we can explore that just for a minute or two here, is, when you're talking about formatively assessing students, getting that student work back, uncovering their thinking, and then making the adjustments from there, where does grading fit into that? Because ultimately something's got to go into the grade book at some point. And
Yes.
we know that unless the grade is truly reflecting the students' learning, their progress, or their mastery of the objectives, then it gets clouded and convoluted, and we really don't have that feedback as a grade. So if we, you laughed because I agree, like that's opening up Pandora's box. But I think I think you make a really good connection between why the grade sometimes doesn't matter. It's about uncovering the thinking. And I think that's where you were going. But if you could just say a little bit more about that space.
Sure. Right. So definitely grading and reporting is more than Pandora's box. It's the whatever it is, the Aladdin, like the genie's out of the bottle sort of scenario. And I'll do a snippet on that for a second, and then I'll jump in to answer your question. Grading and reporting gets into a lot of times, and I'm generalizing, grading and reporting can get into our value system. And that's why it's so difficult and messy, and it's worthy of our conversation and exploration. But a lot of times the way we set up our grading and reporting represents our values. And so that's why sometimes that doesn't work for all students. So I'm going to leave that there, and we can talk on another day about all that good stuff. But to your point, when you are thinking about student work and you're thinking about the feedback, the secret sauce is the success criteria.
Yeah.
So for example, if you have a standard that's related to, and I'm still using real simple terms, this can work K-12, any classroom. But if you have a standard in kindergarten where students need to be able to identify character and setting, that's part of the secret sauce. Like, that's the success criteria. If we look at it and it doesn't have setting and it doesn't have characters, well, it's real easy to say the student is not at standard. So you can obviously take your success criteria based on whatever you teach, and you can create rubrics that are very useful. And Susan Burkhart has entire books on that as well, on rubrics and how that fits into formative assessment. But if we jump to grading, then we're kind of sliding down that spectrum towards more summative work. Yeah. So we need to understand the difference on the front side of what is the purpose. So if the purpose of the assessment is to move learning forward, then we are squarely in formative assessment lane. If the purpose of the assessment is to report out to, the state of Virginia how you did on an end of grade test, obviously that's summative. There's room for both. There's plenty. We need these things. As educators, we need to be very mindful of what's the purpose of what I'm doing, and how can I use this data to better inform my decision making, and ultimately increase achievement for students, for all students.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for indulging me. I just, you said something that just made me really think about that connection. So I appreciate you. Leaving and I had never heard it explained that way. Grading and reporting gets into our values. And so I love that. I love that phrase. And so I'm going to come back to that in my own practice, in my own thoughts, because I do think what you hit on at the end is, it's central to everything. It's central to the polarities. It's central to the grading. It's central to what's in the standards. It's central to what gets banned and what doesn't get banned. But it's what is the purpose of education? And so, that's like kind of the big. But when you talk about what is the purpose of assessment, that will help you understand whether or not it's autopsy or it's check-in, and how it's going to inform moving forward. I'd love to move into some immediate next steps for our listeners. So if you don't mind, just if you could help us understand and maybe identify a couple of immediate next steps, either for folks who are loving what you're saying and extremely interested, and they're ready to start the work, or some folks who have kind of engaged in looking at student work to uncover thinking, but are looking to take it to the next level. And I'm before you answer the question, I want to take this moment to plug your book for you. For those of you watching on YouTube, her book is right there in front of you. You've been looking at it this whole episode. For me, I would believe that step one would be go buy the book and read it. So the immediate next step, buy the book. But outside of that, Alice, if you could just kind of unpack that for us, for our listeners on the podcast channel and anyone viewing on our YouTube channel, just what are some immediate next steps?
Well, I think the easiest thing to do is think about, for next step would be, what student work do you have access to that shows student thinking? So that sounds super simple, but some of the student work we have doesn't actually show any thinking at all. And so just think about, okay, what have I got in front of me that shows student thinking? It could be a writing sample, not necessarily, you know, a dissertation, but just a student writing sample, something informal, or it could be something formal. It could be a project. It could be drawings. It could be anything that requires them to reveal their thinking. I even had a teacher in the project who recorded students in pairs sharing their thinking with each other, because these were very young children. And that was a great sample for us to dig into, to look at the thinking of students. So first step is, what have you got that shows the student thinking? Second step is, do you have anybody who will talk to you about it? Just get together and start looking at, what were you trying to have them learn? Because that's going to be your standard and your success criteria. And then what do you notice? And from there, your conversation is going to flow. And the key piece to keep things moving forward is going to be that feedback piece. So if you're not familiar with, you know, how to give effective feedback, I highly recommend, obviously learning some of that. It's obviously in the book, but that feedback piece is sort of that oil that keeps everything going. If we stop, then the learning stops. And so it's just part of that formative cycle. And so a lot of times in our classrooms, we're trying to you know, do these major renovations or refreshes and all this stuff. But sometimes what it boils down to is, have we sat down with the kids and given them feedback?
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about your work, is that, you know, what you're talking about is feedback for two sides of this dance. It's feedback for the kids to think about their thinking and to improve their thinking and to advance their learning. And it's feedback for the teacher for what adjustments need to be made. You know, how is my instruction and how is the student progressing? So keep going. I interrupted you. I think you were going to keep going about some immediate next steps.
No. That was
okay.
it. That was exactly, you know, I think it's important. We need to keep things as simple as possible. And so if you have no resources whatsoever, but you have student work, you can get started. You just need to make sure that the student work shows thinking. And then you just need a friend to talk to about, what are you noticing? How can you give feedback to that student? And then what are some possible next steps that you could have with that?
I think that's gosh, that's so great. And another thing that I wrote down that we don't have to unpack because we're starting to run out of time. But it's amazing how fast 30 minutes goes when the conversation is so deeply engaging. I love what you said about, you were talking about if the assessment is designed to uncover student thinking. I think that's some powerful stuff right there. And you know, if you design an assessment that's not going to uncover thinking, then don't bother looking at that student work to uncover the thinking, because you're not going to find it.
Right.
So,
right. Or another example recently is that projects. A lot of times we have these incredible activities that we love as educators, and we've done them for 1,000 years. But then when we really look at the thinking behind the project, it's really just regurgitating information. And that's different. So it doesn't give us the quality of the information to use to make decisions versus, their poster was really pretty and they were able to stand up and tell you 14 things that, Princess Diana did in her life. But what do they really know? And so it causes a disturbance sometimes on the front side, but really thinking about what thinking came out of this task.
That's awesome. All right, Alice, I'm gonna let you go now. But before we do, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all educators who are tuning in, and on behalf of VASCD. Thank you. Thank you for carving out time for us to share your wisdom, your expertise, and your experience. And we at Virginia ASCD would also like to give you an opportunity to share with the community how they can connect with you and become part of your learning network.
Well, thank you so much for having me this afternoon. And one way they can reach me is at obviously the website on the screen. And I'm over here on the contact us, I guess, page, probably that comes directly to me. It looks fancy, but it just comes to me. So the other thing is we are on Twitter at Learn with ERG, and that's also our Instagram and Facebook page. But yeah, I would love to hear from anybody who has questions, thoughts, anybody who decides to use this information and has student work samples and a story behind it. I would love to hear it. Because I don't think there's any more important work right now than the work we're doing with our students. And I love to hear folks who are doing the hard.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you again, Alice. And for our listeners on the podcast channel, thank you for tuning in. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you for spending the time with us today. If you are not currently subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time on Deeper Insights.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris.